והגדת לבנך ביום ההוא, and you should tell over to your son at that day, meaning the day of Pesach, Lamar telling him, for the sake of this, in other words, for the sake of the doing the mitzvahs and the seder and so on, Hashem did to me and for me when I went on Mitzrayim. So what is this referring to specifically? The Koyal Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, Shanikra B'Shem Haggadah. It's referring to the relating of going out of Mitzrayim, telling over the story. That's called Haggadah. And since this is a Maamar said on Shabbos Haggadah, so the Rebbe connects it with Shabbos Haggadah as well. Shenoigim L'Omra B'Shabbos Haggadah. The custom is to say the Haggadah and Shabbos Haggadah. Ma'avodim Mayinu Ad L'Chapra Kol Me'aseinu. From the section of the Haggadah that begins with Avodim Mayinu, right after the Manishtan, until after Dayenu, the part that says L'Chapra Kol Me'aseinu. Why is it called Haggadah? One of the reasons that it's explained is from this very pasuk. Al Shem V'Gad Lebincha. It's called Haggadah because we are fulfilling the mitzvah of V'Gad Lebincha, K'meshikasav Abadram, like the Abadram Pirush explains. And for this reason, because it's the Haggadah is taken from what it says V'Gad Lebincha, so that's why it's not just enough to think about it, to remember in your mind Yitzias Mitzrayim. Therefore, it has to be specifically in speech. And according to some opinions, that's the difference between, or some explanations, that's the difference between the way we're supposed to remember. It says we have to remember what happened in Mitzrayim, and what we have to remember on Pesach night. So Schiras Yitzias Mitzrayim every day doesn't have to be necessarily in speech. You don't necessarily have to verbalize it, according to Mefarshim. But by night, since it says V'Gada Levincha, you're telling it over to your son. That's not much of it. That's something that involves speech. So that's one of the unique aspects of Seder night versus the way we're supposed to remember the mitzvah of Yitzias Mitzrayim every day. Then in the Seder night, you're supposed to actually enunciate it in speech. Another point that we learn out from the fact that it says it has to be said in the way of a response to a question. His son has to ask him, if he doesn't have a son, so then his wife has to ask him, because it needs to be a response, not just a saying. So the Rebbe asks, so we need to understand what it says. You will tell your son in that day, for this, for the sake of this. The Lachura seemingly, seemingly, what's the connection between that day? That is like in the concealed language, meaning like third person. It's not present. It's somewhere concealed. And zeh, that's like right in front of you. That's like second person. But it's an object in the way of revelation. So the Rebbe wants to know, obviously it's more up to Chassidus, the connection between dealing with concealment by Yom Ahu and then going into zeh. Also, what's the idea that it says that Havai did for me when I went out of Mitzrayim? Lidaik is specifically that it's something that happened to me. Oizbeis. The Tzemach Tzedek explains, the one whose yahrzeit is on Yud Gimel Nissen, he explains, Ba'or HaTorah, why specifically is there a mitzvah to relate and to tell over? Yitzias Mitzrayim specifically in speech and telling it over. Why isn't that enough to do it in memory and mind? Because at the time when the Yidden went out of Mitzrayim, speech was in a state of golus. Like it's written in the Zohar. What does this mean that it was in golus? the Chagav, the Zohar brings down that this is what Moshe Rabbeinu said, Eichish me'eni parei. How will Pari listen to me? That's because the idea of speech was in a state of Golus. What's the idea of speech that's in a state of Golus? So he says in line 19, V'hainu ki adibur zeu gilu. The idea of speech that shows on revelation. Just like in the future it says, V'ro kol basar goymer. Ki pi havaya diber. All flesh will see that the mouth of Hashem spoke. So we see that when we're talking about revelation, then it's manifest in the idea of speech. That's why in Mashiach's times there's going to be pi havaya diber. Everybody will appreciate and everybody will see Hashem speaking. Mash'enkin k'shad diber begolus, as opposed to when the speech is in a state of golus, of exile. Top of page Vav. Ksiv, it says, Kirochel, like a sheep, lefnei goyzezel nalama, before its shearers it is silent. That indicates the level of silence, shows on state of exile being in control of someone else. The shearers are balabatvan over the sheep. Like it says, Nelamti dumiyam. David HaMelech says until him, David is also the level of Spheres Malchus, that I'm silent. What does that mean? Beruchnius, what is the silence referring to? There's Hashem's speech of the 10 utterances with which the Eibishter created the world. Is in a way of silence. What does it mean that it's silent? It's not recognizable. One does not perceive and see that Hashem's Asar Amoris, the Dvar Havaya, is revealed in the world, is functioning in the world. And it seems to be that we not receive our life force and vitality from the 10 utterances themselves, rather through garments and hairs. Hair shows on a very minimal and constricted amount of energy that conceal the level of speech, etc. Behind this means the entire duration of the exile Mitzrayim, this supernal speech was in a state of Golus. The revelation of Hashem in this world, the recognition of the Asar Amoris, that was concealed. That's why when going out of Mitzrayim, there's a mitzvah to tell over, specifically b'dibur dafkin, not just to remember it in our mind, specifically in speech. Because the idea of the geula, the redemption, is revealing the level of speech which beforehand during Golus was concealed. Second paragraph on the page, line 11. And the Tzemach Tzedek adds to explain further concerning the exact language that he uses, V'gadata. If all we want to say is that there needs to be the level of speech, so there is many other words in Lashon Kodesh for speech. Why specifically V'gadata? The Tzemach Tzedek says we can note from Malchus al pasuk. He also vagid lachem, from what it says in the pasuk, what it says in the Zohar and the pasuk, that Yaakov Avinu gathered his children. He said, "He also gather yourselves va'agid lachem, and I will tell you over." And I believe we learned a Maamar on this on Parshas Vayechi, that Rabbi Yossi shal Rabbi Shimon. That Rabbi Yossi asked Rabbi Shimon, Amar Loi, he told him, Avagida, Oi vayagid, Oi vayigidu, V'chein kula de taninan, de raza de chachmasa ihu. That all of these expressions that I just now enumerated, that is part of the same shayrish of Haggadah, all of these things are indicating the mystery and the secret and the deepest level of Chachma. Amai b'mila da b'chulu ihu raza de chachmasa. Why specifically in this word and all of these and this type of combination of letters is there hinted at the secrets of Chachma? In the previous Maamar that we learned about it, we spoke about it, that has to do with revealing the secrets of the Achras HaYomim, so therefore it has to do with the secrets in the Chachma. Amar lei, so Rab Shimon ben Yochai answered Rabbi Yossi, begin the ihu mila da asya begimel daled. Since it's a word that's made up of the letters gimel daled, because it's gimel daled, that has to do with the secrets of the Chachma come out over there. That's what the Zohar says. So in the Mefoirish on the Zohar, or Pirish Mikdash Melech Sham, the Mikdash Melech commentary on the Zohar explains, Shem Zeir Anpin V'Nukva. Gimel and Daled, these correspond to the Midas of Atzilus, or in general, all the spheres of Atzilus, and the level of Malchus. Moving on Maamar Azal, it's also understood from what the Chazal say, that Gimel Daled is hinting at Gemoil Dalim, that to do kindness to the poor. Varei Dalim Koyal Spheres of Malchus. The level of the poor ones refers to Spheres of Malchus because the lesser Magamoklum has nothing of its own. So Gimel Daled is the Hashpah of the Spheres above Malchus into Malchus. Therefore, V'imkein al derech zehu inyan v'yigadata. So too is the idea of v'yigadata, just like v'agida is the chibur of the joining of the spheres above Malchus. With Malchus, that's why it's the level of Raza the Chachma, so it's the secrets and the most deepest mysteries of Chachma. So in a similar vein, it's also the V'agdat Lebincha by us. The Tzemach Tzedek says in our pasuk, L'chaber yachad zeirampim v'nukva, to join together the spheres above Malchus and Malchus. And how is that joined? Aidei Haggadah v'sipur zeh, through this relating it and telling it over. Shugamkin in chibur mashpia makabel. It's also about the joining of mashpia makabel, just like in a simple sense, that when you're telling it over to someone, especially as we explained at the beginning of the Maamar, it's a response to the questions that are asked. So there's a union between Mashpia and Makabel. This reflects the union of the Mashpia and the Makabel of the spheres above Malchus with Malchus. Similar to what it says concerning the Mon, that it was like this type of thing called Zragad. I forgot what they translate this in English. What's this God standing for? The Yalk Shemaini explains, Shedoimela Agoda. This is similar to Agadata. Shemamsheches Libe Shalodam, top of page Zion. The idea of Agadata that draws a person. Sometimes a person is not completely open to an in-depth study of halacha or deep concepts. So how do you draw the person in? You draw the person in with Agadata, with different types of stories and droshim and psukim, not so in-depth and involved type of learning. And then, once you draw him in that way, you start off with Agadata, then you can get into something deeper. But the Rebbe is going to explain that Agadata, that's Moishech Libe Shalodam, is because of this union of Mashpia Makabel. V'hainu ki Agada hi yichud Gimel and Dalet. Agada is the union of the letter Gimel with the Dalet, Zeirampim v'Nukva, the spheres of Atzilus with Malchus. And where exactly does the union take place? So the spheres HaYesod, the last of the spheres before Malchus, is where it joins. Hayidei Hayud Shebesoif HaGimel. The bottom of the Gimel, there's a leg pointing towards the Dalet. That's like spheres HaYesod. That's what's joining. Shu Yesod, that joins the Midas above, or all the spheres above with Malchus. So now we're going back with Mezem moving she'inin the V'agdat Hu she'gili b'chinas ha'dibur ba'ofen she'makal b'chinas ha'chachma. Now we go back to what the Reb Shimon told Rabbi Yossi, that, or even more so, Rabbi Yossi himself said that it's the idea of Mila de Chachma, that through the revelation of speech becoming revealed. How is speech revealed? Because you have the Hamshacha that comes from the spheres above Malchus into Malchus, which Malchus on its own is silent because Lesla Magamo Klum. So you have the Hamshacha from the spheres above to come into Malchus. So then that communicates, that draws down. Now from the level of Chachma, it should come out. So now what's the idea of specifically of a son? It says specifically, you shall tell over to your son. It's similar to what it says, Shal avicha v'yagetcha. It says, ask of your father and he will tell you. What's the idea of this level of Haggadah, that it's matters of Chachma, nimshach idei avicha dafke, comes specifically through your father. What's the significance of the role of the father over here? The main union of the Spheres and Malchus. Nimshach aide Abba Ilah Dafke, the level of Chachma, the supernal father, that is what causes that there should be a union between the Gimel and Dalet, between the Spheres and Malchus. Sham Shachem Misham Einam Ba'efen Shalish Talshlos Ilava Alol Aide Hefsikul. Because when you get the Hamshacha from such a high level, from the level of Chachmeilah, from the level of Avicha, the level of your father, so then it doesn't come in a way of a general, orderly chain descent. Aidei Hefsik, and that means that in the whole Hemshuch that goes on, there's like separations and divisions now. It's actually the very essence itself that is above comes down below, and that is only because, and thanks to the level of the Oir of Chachma, since the Oir of Chachma is above and beyond everything, so therefore it ensures that the communication and what comes over from the Gimel to the Daled is the very essence. And therefore, now we could see how the speech is in a state of, instead of being in a state of Golus, which is the level of Mitzrayim and Golus, it comes out of Golus, Yitzias Mitzrayim. That's the process of Vigad. Line 13. We can add to this. The pasuk that you will tell over to your son says concerning the child that doesn't know how to ask. Of the 4 children, that he is the lowest of the 4 children. Chacham is in the world of Atzilus, and Rasha is in the world of Bria, and Tam is in the world of Yitzira. Ein Yedei Lishol, he doesn't know how to ask. That's the lowest. That's in the world of Asiyah, as he's going to say Shem Keneged Arbas Oil Matzatzilus Bria Yitzira Asiyah. Just like also simply put, that we enumerate them in that order in the Haggadah, because even the Rasha is in a certain degree, in a certain aspect, higher than the Tam, and the Tam for sure is higher than the Ein Yedei Lishol. The Ein Yedei Lishol is lowest in everything. Behind this means the drawing down of the wisdom of Chachma, which is Vigadata, reaches to the most lowest level. That's how powerful this Hamshacha is that we're bringing down. By Dezeh, and through the Hamshacha reaching down such a low level, there becomes an ascent in all the levels. Like the well-known metaphor, an example of raising up the walls of a house. How do you raise it up? You need to start from the lowest beam or part of the house or the wall. Then automatically the higher layers of the building will be raised up. But if you just pull up the house from the top, the bottom ones will remain below. So the same thing over here, by having Vigad Lebincha, dealing all the way that this pasuk is talking about the She'en Yedei Lishol. So through that, elevating and bringing this Gilui down all the way to the lowest most level, so then it's elevated to the highest level. And he continues in the Mamshech and the pasuk continues, top of page Ches. You will tell your son in that day to say, for this sake Hashem did to me when I went out of Mitzrayim. The idea that it says, in that day, for the sake of this, that we said, it's like that day is Lashon Nister, Zeh is Lashon Noichach. Al derech masha kasav, it's similar to what it says, Maamar Bayom Ahuu, and he will say in that day, Hine Elokeinu Zeh, here is, behold, this God. So again, we see this type of contrast. Yom Ahuu, that day, showing unconcealment, and Hine Elokeinu Zeh, revelation of godliness, this. Like the Shalah explains, Shetagid lo inyan Bayom Ahuu, that you have to tell them over the idea of that day. Shehu bechinas astir ponai bayom hahu, that it says, I will surely conceal my face in that day. Shahester hu kedei shivak. What's the reason for Hashem's concealment? So that they should search him. Therefore, through this should come down the level of for the sake of this, behold, this the God. So that's what it means, why it says that V'agדת Lebincha Bayom Hahu, that the concealment is for the Zeh. It's understood the quality of the revelation of the level of Zeh that comes after the concealment of in that day, because when you have a revelation that comes out of concealment, it's similar to the idea that intentional sins become transformed like merits through tshuva. That's why it's greater, the quality of Baal Tshuva in comparison to Tzaddik. If we could add, the idea that it says Zeh is also connected with what it says this month is to you. It's the idea of the head of the month, then the moon is born. That's when the sun joins with the moon. When the moon is concealed, it's not reflecting any light of the sun because it's not receiving it in the correct way. So it's missing the joining. But the joining of the sun and the moon is al derech yichud zerampin v'nukva. It's similar to the joining of the Spheres and Malchus, chibur mashpia makabel. The joining of the giver and the receiver should be in v'agדת. That's the point of v'agדת, that the mashpia gives over to the makabel. Chaniska leil siv beis, like we said before in ois beis. So that's why also it says because it recollects the idea of a chodesh hazeh. Ois daled. Simon concludes, also he did for me when I went out of Mitzrayim, li daike. The chol makom shnemer li ein azaz lo'ilam, wherever it says the word li, it never moves. V'hainu, this means the key v'shnim shecharaz the chachmas v'gat ad lamata mata, top of page 10, since the secret, the mystery of chachma, you should relate, comes down to below. The lowest level of bincha to your son, she'ein yadei lishol, even to someone that doesn't know how to ask, to such a degree we transform the concealment of that day into the revelation, for the sake of this revelation. It's in such a way that it never moves. There's no change. Similar to the advantage and quality of Baal Tshuva in regards to Baal Tzaddik. Since he withstood the test, so that itself is something that he stands higher than a tzaddik, because a tzaddik didn't deal with tests, not in the way the Baal Tshuva did. To such a degree that intentional sins becomes like a merit. So then for sure the Baal Tshuva will never change and fall back, because he has withstood the negative. Because the hamshacha comes from a very elevated place. That's the idea that when I went out of Mitzrayim doesn't just mean the physical Mitzrayim, but also it indicates going out of all constraints and boundaries, beyond every type of measure and boundary. Until the true bligvul. That's why it will never move. He calls man as long as the avoid is measured and has a boundary, in other words, constraints. There could be changes. But when the avoid is beyond measure and boundary, I go out of Mitzrayim. It's in such a way that it will never move. I say, final piece, we can connect the idea of Vigat Levincha, drawing down the secret of Chokmah with the Geula. According to what's explained in Zohar and the parshas by Vayera, the Chadyav Kroy Yom Mashiach will become close to the days of Mashiach. I feel Ravya da Alma, even the children of the world, even little children, Bincha, which is the same idea of Gata Levincha, Zminin Lashkacha Tmirin the Chachmasa, will be ready to find the secrets and to be around the secrets of wisdom. The Inus and Nasai, the Afatzas and Mayonas, the Pnimis HaTorah, through that, this becomes through the spreading of the wellsprings of the inner part of Torah. Through this, the Master will come, the King Mashiach.